Welcome to the Daily Footnote for today. Chris, I've got a question for you. We spoke last week about how you had a top 10 reasons. What are the top 10 reasons?
Top 10 reasons for why I trust Christianity?
That's the one.
Great. All right. Let me run through them. Number one, the resurrection of Jesus is really historically likely. I remember I went through a season of doubting during university. I was wondering whether the Christian faith was real, and so I went back to the historical evidence of the resurrection, and it holds up incredibly well. I mentioned a little bit of that in the first talk we did for the first podcast, so I won't go over that here. You can find little handy guides. There's lots of things out there that you can check out that'll just run you through different resurrection evidence. There's books that have been written about it, but it's compelling. It holds up really well, and it's persuaded many people to follow Jesus just on the basis of that reason alone. Number two, the rise of Christianity in the 1st to 3rd centuries, despite persecution in the Roman Empire, despite the sacrificial love required to be a follower of Jesus, despite all sorts of losses, social standing, family cost, Christianity spread, it grew. Other religions didn't do that. Christianity took off and spread across cultures through the Roman Empire and beyond the Roman Empire, and I don't think there's a compelling explanation out there except that it was true and it was transforming lives. Number three, the testimonies of the first believers. We had Jewish men calling a man God. It just doesn't happen. People calling Jesus God is absurd for Jewish people to do. Number two, we have the Apostle Paul, who completely turns his life upside down. He starts off by trying to hunt down, arrest, and kill Christians, and then he becomes a Christian himself. He completely changes his life. We have his account in the Bible. He writes a lot of the New Testament. Something happened to him. We have the accounts of other disciples of Jesus that they're willing to die for Jesus. They go from cowardly to willing to die for him. You don't die for a cause that you made up. They really believe this is true. It transformed them and it transforms others. Number four, the testimony of millions and billions of Christians across centuries and cultures. The way the Bible makes sense for people from so many different places at different times is really compelling. It's not just limited to the culture of the people who wrote it. It makes sense of the world for us, which ties into number five, the Bible's explanatory powers. It makes sense of the brokenness of our world. It makes sense of people. It makes sense of the brokenness in me. It gives a plausible reason for hope and joy. It gives a plausible purpose, injecting my life with meaning. It explains life and death, and it gives them meaning. It makes sense of my deepest desires. The need in my soul for grace, for kindness from God, despite my addiction to just wanting to be a law follower, my need for forgiveness. And just when I see Jesus, when I read about him in the Gospels, my heart just says, yes, that's what I want. That's what I was made for. Number six, I've encountered supernatural events that are best explained by Christianity. Number seven, the unparalleled ethical vision of the Bible. It knows what love is better than anything else I've ever come across. And it directs on how to love better than anything else I've ever come across. Number eight, the positive life change I've seen in me and in others. Favorite story I've shared a number of times before, but I remember in 4th year uni, I was hanging out with a girl I used to hang out with in 1st year uni, and she looked at me at one point and she said, "You know what, Chris? I really like hanging out with you now. You're not as much of a jerk as you used to be." And it was so good because I became a Christian after we'd stopped hanging out in 1st year uni. A few years later, she could look at me and just see the difference. She's like, "Oh, you're a kinder person than you used to be." And I think, man, that's God working in me. And I've seen God transform other people's lives as well in even more dramatic ways. Number nine, I mentioned this in the talk, but the way the Old Testament so wonderfully anticipates Jesus. I like to read the Old Testament and put in purple anything that I think is really obviously pointing to Jesus. And every time I go through the Old Testament, I just get more and more purple. It's got a lot of purple in it now. There are just so many arrows pointing towards Jesus. Jesus is that keystone that just fills out where the Old Testament is headed. And yet, number 10, the way Jesus transcends any anticipation about himself. I shared this in the talk as well, but he just doesn't make sense as a product of his time. Even though the Old Testament so completely anticipates him, he doesn't fit what his disciples expected him to be. And that's part of their disappointment with him at times, that he's not being what they think he should be. He's more moral, more wonderful, more kind. Just he goes beyond a fabrication that people could have come up with at that time. So those are my 10 reasons. Not my only reasons, my 10 favorite reasons for why I believe Christianity and why I follow Jesus.
Nice.